Hi everybody, and welcome to the Reed Center for Ecosystem Reintegration. I'm Ben.
I'm Bobby.
And really today what we're going to be talking to you about is where we're coming from in terms of how our current food system operates and how we can actually learn from the brilliance of nature to produce the food that we need going forward into the future. So one of the things that I like to talk about in the beginning of this conversation is that I wouldn't even be able to have this conversation if it wasn't for the systems that we currently have. Like right now, how much of our diet, how much of the calories that we're using actually to speak to everyone out there are coming from monoculture systems?
Probably a good bit of it, more than I'd like to admit to.
Yeah,
But that's
and that's the reality for nearly all of us at this point on the entire planet. And so when you look behind us and you just see how much land is currently under cultivation here, we're in Western Maryland, in Middletown, Maryland, just outside of Frederick. So we're just a little over an hour outside of DC. And almost all of this land is being used to grow corn and soy, mostly corn. And almost all of that is being used for animal feed. So when we look at this ecosystem behind us, how much of that land is barren or plants that are only a couple inches tall? And we just had a rip-roaring rain just yesterday, and soil was just pouring out of all of these farms and going right into the waterways, out into the Potomac, and then downstream into the Chesapeake Bay. So when you look at those crops that we are growing most commonly around the world, rice, wheat, and corn, wheat more than any of them, all three of those have something in common that I don't think people recognize, which is that they're all annual grasses. And annual grasses, they produce so much grain because they have to produce so many grains in order for them to be able to find a place in a wild ecosystem where they can actually grow again. So the places where they became abundant were places where there were natural disasters every single year. And those natural disasters were floods, fires, and then people started plowing and using herbicides and things like that we're doing now to recreate those natural disasters. Because if you look at the land right here behind us, this is all 1 year of growth. So if you're looking at Maryland as just its own thing, the vast majority of our land right here is being used to grow corn and soy, mostly corn, and nearly all as animal feed. So when you kind of zoom out outside of Maryland and see that all around the world we're growing these annual plants, we're talking wheat, number one, rice, and corn, all of those being annual grasses. And those annual grasses, if you put them right here in this ecosystem and just let all of the corn grow on those ecosystems and let all that corn fall down to the ground, what you would find is the next year, very little, if any, of that corn will grow. And that's because as soon as perennial plants, like what you see right behind us, this is 1 year growth of perennial grasses that took foot on what used to be a GMO cornfield, the corn cannot compete. So the reason why these plants produce so much grain is so that that grain can actually find a niche of ground where there's no other plants that can compete with it so that it can grow. So in the Fertile Crescent, where there were constant floods, all that new sediment would bring new nutrition, but most importantly, it would knock down and take out any competing plants that would compete with the wheat that they were growing in that region. So now what we're doing is having on a global scale, like a third of the entire globe, a third of the entire landmass of Earth is now under some kind of artificial natural disaster every single year, multiple times a year. And those are burning of the land, that's creating artificial floodplains, that's using plows, and most recently herbicides to take down all of the competing plant life that would take over that landmass. And what we're about to show you is that the raw potential of this particular ecosystem is nothing short of astonishing. And just because it's economically the most viable thing perhaps to grow is corn and soy, it makes no ecological sense, because right here on the east coast of the United States, we're capable of being a breadbasket. So we're going to go on a little walk into the forest and just show you the raw potential of what this ecosystem can produce.
Yeah, that was good.
So a lot of people assume that the only way abundance can be created is by human hands. And the reality is that in letting this field go from GMO corn to fallow, what we're standing in front of right now is the antithesis of that. Right here, no human beings planted any of this. In fact, it was mostly birds that planted out this little bramble patch that we're in front of. We're talking blackberries, there's wineberries, there's black raspberries, there's mulberries, all growing in this little patch. In only 2 years, this huge patch of human food that's going to be way healthier than what we're going to get in our stores, especially the stuff that's going to be coming from over 3,000 miles away. And we didn't have to do anything to produce it. In fact, getting out of the way was all we did.
So keeping with getting out of the way of nature and what's possible when we get out of the way, we'll take a nice little look at a grove of tulip poplar here. This is just 2 years out. So right over there was 1 year. We're now looking at 2 years of growth. We didn't plant this. This hasn't been fertilized. It hasn't been watered. This is natural succession in action. These plants are traveling from the forest and seeding out here. And a little bit farther, you can see 3-year trees. And then just behind those, we've got about 35 to 40 years worth of growth in these tulip poplars that no one has planted, no one has watered, and no one has irrigated, and yet abundance is rebounding and bursting at the seams.
The forest happens. Please connect with us here at the Reed Center. If you are not regional, we really implore you to go and find any of the permaculture sites in your area, eco-villages, and realize that it was never meant to be for 1% or less of the population to be producing all of the food for the rest of us. We've got to reconnect with the food supply in whatever ways we can. And please let us know how we can be of help to you in getting you started in your regenerative life.
So getting our list started, at number 9, we have adopt a zero waste lifestyle. That starts with the most obvious kind of things, like bringing your own bag when you go to a grocery store. Just implementing bag taxes has reduced the consumption of single-use plastics dramatically in a number of different states that have chosen to implement the bag tax. But I think even without it, there's more than enough incentive for us to just go ahead and make the small investment to have grocery store bags that will last for many, many years. One of the other things we also like to do in adopting a zero-waste lifestyle is buying in bulk and bringing our own jars to the grocery store in order to carry the goods that we want to subsist on. This is a great way to eliminate plastics and single-use plastics, and kind of points to a broader theme as well, which is to focus your diet on whole foods that don't involve any packaging. This onion, the only packaging on it is the skin, and that's totally compostable, 100% organic. So that's another great step in this zero waste lifestyle, is just focusing on a whole foods diet. And that's what we have this nice little nut milk bag here for, to show off Ellie's Best, a nice little company that makes these nut strainer bags. You can just take something as simple as 1 cup of rolled oats and blend it up with 3 or 4 cups of water, depending on the flavor that you like. Maybe a little pinch of salt, spoonful of honey, and you've got yourself a homemade nut milk that doesn't involve this big plastic box that carries a bunch of embodied energy along with it. So yeah, number 9, definitely adopt a zero waste lifestyle.
All right, so coming in at number 8, we've got reclaimed and natural resources. Here at the Reed Center, we're building a big garden bed and we want to terrace it off. So we've decided to rely on one of the most abundant local natural resources that we can get our hands on, and that's black locust. It's an incredible material that is very widely available and easy to find. Another great local natural material that is often available and people are happy to have you come harvest is bamboo. So as we build fencing out here, we might choose to use bamboo as a building material rather than going to Home Depot or Lowe's and purchasing lumber that was logged out of the Pacific Northwest and shipped all the way over here. So you can see how quickly it gets problematic for us to consciously consume from large-scale multinational corporations and such. So we want to look to nature as much as possible. Now, beyond nature, beyond these natural resources like bamboo, black locust, wood chips, there's also reclaimed materials that are often available in areas that are closer to cities or suburban and even sometimes in rural areas. In a lot of places you can find things like these burlap sacks. If you find a local coffee roaster, you can get burlap sacks and use these for a number of different things, not the least of which is carrying big bundles of roots and veggies. We've been using it a lot as a weed suppressant to lay down as a kind of natural weed fabric that will break down into the soil. And then another great example of a reclaimed material that's readily available is this beautiful 5-gallon bucket. Now, if I went to Lowe's or Home Depot, I would have to pay one of these multinational corporations and feed into their profit line by spending $5 or $6 on a petrochemical bucket that involves a lot of embodied energy to create and distribute. Meanwhile, the grocery store that I go to pick up my salads and bags of root veggies, they have a pastry department, and in that pastry department they get big buckets of icing, and this one in particular was cream cheese icing once upon a time at a Safeway. And now, instead of cream cheese icing, this is holding probably about 250 white walnuts bedded down in sawdust that I got for free from a local lumber mill. So instead of holding cream cheese icing and going into a trash can, this is now serving as a small nursery for hundreds of native nut trees. So number 8, value those reclaimed and natural materials and seek them out wherever you are. All right, coming in at number 7 is adopt a plant-based lifestyle. This is easily one of the most impactful changes we can make in our consumption habits, because the animal agriculture industry has gotten so huge and so destructive, and it's so dependent on fossil fuels. It requires more water, it requires more nutrients, it requires more land. Of the 900 million acres that we currently have in cultivation in the United States, the vast majority of it is being dedicated to animal agriculture in one form or another. And I think one of the worst forms of that is exemplified in petrochemical monoculture crops. These kinds of fields are largely cultivated simply to raise food for animals that are kept in captivity. Confined animal feeding operation industry has gotten huge, and it's very, very destructive. The amount of methane released by cows overshadows the carbon produced by every factory in the world. It's an incredible amount of greenhouse gases released from animal agriculture. There's so many things to say about this, but lots of other people have covered this topic in depth, and we just wanted to bring it in at number 7 on our list. So please choose a plant-based lifestyle. And while we're on that plant-based subject, I think it's also important to note that not all plant-based foods are created equal. Some things like palm oil, for example, contribute to a large amount of deforestation in places like the Philippines and Southeast Asia, so they can be very problematic as well. Things like the almond crop, when we go and consume alternative plant-based milks, we want to make sure that we're avoiding almonds as much as possible because they're coming from California and requiring, each individual almond requires over a gallon of water. That's in a good year. It requires a gallon of water. That's a tremendous tax on California's already struggling aquifers. And as drought becomes more of an issue and wildfires become more of an issue there, we've got to rein that in and choose very wisely. And that brings us to number 6. Coming in at number 6 is eat local. No matter how much we choose plant-based, organic foods, it's important for us to tune in to the sources of those foods. The vast majority of organic produce in this country, and the vast majority of produce in general in this country, is coming from California. And for us here in Maryland, DC area, that's 3,000 miles away. That's quite a lot of energy that it takes for us to get this box of organic romaine lettuce. And how much nutrition do you think has been lost in that process? And how much vitality do you think has been lost in that process? How many people do you think are getting exploited in order to bring it into our grocery stores at a price point of $3 per package? There's a lot going on there that does not get calculated. And when we go local, we're doing more than just bringing down our carbon footprint. We're supporting local farmers, we're supporting local businesses, we're developing relationships with people in our community where it counts. And that's what is going to give our communities the kind of resiliency to get through the various challenges that might come up, whether it be economic challenges or pandemic-related challenges, as we're all currently seeing right now. The value of supporting our local farmers goes far beyond increased nutrition and decreased carbon footprint. So please get out there and develop those relationships. Buy local, support local businesses. So the first 4 that we discussed all fall into the category of conscious consumerism. This next one is where we shift from consciously consuming to consciously producing. This is the shift from consumerism to producerism. And we're going to start with producing our own wine. Good old-fashioned wine is one of the, I think, most beautiful places for people to begin their relationship with producing something for so many reasons, not the least of which is that in this consumer kind of culture that we've been brought up in, the relationship between people and alcohol has become a very destructive one. And when we reclaim this tradition of winemaking, it encourages us to build relationships with the plants around us. It encourages us to connect with the seasonal fruits and vegetables that are around in each time of year. And it encourages us to develop a relationship with the microbial communities that can not only convert sugar into alcohol, but they can also support our bodies in our health and wellness. So when we talk about brewing wine, it can be as simple as sugar, water, and yeast. Or if we want to brew mead, it can be as simple as honey, water, and yeast. And when we bring in these kinds of traditions, we are drawing on a tradition that is thousands and thousands of years old. And we are reawakening a connection to all life around us. And especially when we are making meads and tapping into raw honey, think about the thousands and thousands of flower blossoms that these bees have gone and sought out and gathered nectar from. And think about all of the different medicinal herbs and plants that we can bring into these herbal elixirs and wines. This is a very, very powerful tradition, and I think it's a very positive and peaceful way to transform our relationship with alcohol and bring people together in celebration and unity. So yeah, get started with winemaking right away. Coming in at number 4, composting. This is definitely one of the superpowers that every human being deserves and needs to develop. And I highly recommend you get your composting career started right away. It doesn't have to be anything super complicated, and you can know that you're contributing to so much regeneration and so much growth and so much fertility being added to your soils. And also you can know that you're taking waste out of the landfills. In 2010, an estimated 33 million tons of food ended up in the landfill, where it sits in an anaerobic condition and releases tons and tons of methane into the atmosphere. Not to mention all of the toxic leachate that ends up washing off of it and polluting our rivers and waterways down the line. So we can totally cut off that stream and eliminate 20 to 40% of our waste stream simply by taking our organic matter and putting it into a nice mix of wood chips and blending together nitrogen and carbon to end up with compost. Things like tape and stickers on vegetables and produce, those are generally not compostable, so we want to fish them out as much as possible. Bad hippies. Now, these food scraps, they're relatively low in the overall nitrogen scheme of things. They're about 10 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And when we're building compost, we want to go for around a 30 to 1 or 25 to 1 ratio carbon to nitrogen. So this bucket of sawdust here is somewhere in the order of 300 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So by simply covering these food scraps with some sawdust, we'll keep the smells down, we'll keep our ratio right, and we'll keep a nice, happy pile of compost. That'll also keep it aerobic, which means the oxygen is going to continually be flowing through it and will reduce the anaerobic methagenic bacteria that are so problematic in the food that finds its way to a landfill. So get yourself a compost pile started today. Coming in at number 3, one of my all-time favorites is foraging. Foraging is an absolute game changer, because when we get out and start connecting with nature by directly gathering our food from wild places, it empowers us on so many levels and brings in a much deeper form of nutrition that our bodies don't normally have access to. Wild plants are inundated with so many different environmental stressors. It forces them to adapt and create these various secondary constituents, secondary metabolites, phytochemicals that then cause our bodies to get more resilient when we consume these plants. Not to mention, there's the level of resiliency that happens in connection with the wild that is not available anywhere else, because all that these plants require is that Mother Nature continue humming along. And in some cases, the plants that we forage in the wild have been around for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even hundreds of millions of years in some cases. And so these are plants that are resilient, that have faced the changes and struggles that this earth has endured over the years, and they've endured right along with it. When we eat plants like this, it makes us into wild, resilient people with incredible endurance and a propensity for adapting to stress and being a source of calmness and centeredness in any amount of chaos. When we look at the practicality of foraging and the potential for an alternative way of feeding people, we don't need to look any farther than the mighty acorn. Oak trees exist all throughout the world, and everywhere that they exist, they've been eaten as a staple food by indigenous peoples and just very wise people in general all throughout the world. Some people say that the oak is what gave birth to civilization because it was the first wild food that gave us the level of abundance that we needed to remain sedentary through an entire winter. 1 pound of acorns shelled and processed equates to over 2,000 calories of food. So in a very short time, you can gather enough food to last you an entire year just by developing a good relationship with that one plant. So get out there and eat something wild every day. It can really change the way that you look at the world. Here we have the wild watercress, Nasturtium officinale. Coming in at number 2 is gardening. This really is, I think, one of the biggest game changers and one of the most empowering steps that we can take towards a more regenerative future. And even if you're living in a city or, some form of concrete jungle, if you can get your hands on some various containers or even like the 5-gallon buckets that we mentioned before, you can go ahead and start yourself a small garden and at least grow your own salad greens and start watching plants as they sprout and grow and develop into this amazing food that sustains us. Growing our own food takes that equation that we were looking at before of how many miles our food is traveling. When we're in that local food mindset, we're thinking about food miles. This takes that an order of magnitude closer to home and brings it down to food feet. How many feet do you have to walk to get from your bed to your breakfast? That's always a great way to think about these things. So if you're living in the city, don't let that obstacle hold you back. Go ahead and find yourself some containers and get started right away. You got these cute little brassicas starting to pop up. We'll have salad in no time. If you're in a more rural location, then I would highly recommend looking into forest gardening. And that's kind of the largest scale of gardening that I really think would be wise for us to focus on, because when we plant a tree, like for example, this chestnut right here, this bed is full of chestnuts. I think there's somewhere around 120 chestnuts in this bed, as well as 60 pecans. If any one of these survives, I've already done better than what the natural average would be. And if that plant survives and makes it to age 15, the odds are it's going to live for over 300 years. And in that 300 years of life, it will be producing hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of food every year. And each one of those pounds has anywhere from around 1,000 to 1,200 calories, depending on the variety and the growing conditions of the season. So the power of perennial plants in general and fruit and nut trees in particular to feed us is absolutely incredible. And when we create space for these trees to grow, we are tapping into that potential and creating a sustainable and resilient food system for generations to come. Now let's say you're living in a more suburban environment and you have a little more space. Go ahead and get yourself an in-ground garden. If you have a sloping hill, you can build a terrace like we did here. If you're working with nice flat ground, you can go ahead and track down some burlap sacks and some horse manure or any other kind of organic matter that you can get your hands on, rotted wood chips, straw, anything that you can use. There's even great sources of nutrient in most cities, a product called leaf grow that's very easy to source and plants grow very well in it. So yeah, depending on the scale that you're operating at, let that determine the scale of food that you get going. And of course, understand that sometimes plants will die, and that's okay. It's all a part of the learning process, and we're all growing in this together. See what I did there? So for those of you who don't have any land at all, there's always guerrilla gardening. Let the whole earth be your garden. There are so many amazing native plants that can use our help, and so many amazing native plants that are here eager to help us. Not the least of which is this groundnut. Apios americana, or this sunroot, or also known as Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosa. These two are absolute powerhouses in terms of their productivity. They're so delicious, they're so easy to grow, they're both native, and I feel really good about spreading these all over the place. Guerrilla gardening can be as simple as scattering some seeds on the edge of a wood line, maybe some squashes or something like that, that'll climb up and produce a little bit of food, all the way up to guerrilla planting long-lived fruit and nut trees and mulching them out and staking them out and putting little flags on them and wearing little vests while you do it so that everybody thinks that you are totally official. You know, we can take this to many different levels, and no matter how long the trees live, they will provide an ecological service while they're there. And if something should happen to them, then we'll just plant so many trees that nothing can happen to all of them. And we'll keep this garden growing forever and ever and ever and ever. So number one on our list is absolutely be a teacher. Spread this word far and wide. We need this message to reach everybody. Let's follow the coronavirus model, and each one of us infects 2.5 people. Or no, let's take it even further than that. And each one of us infects 10 people. Each one of us gets 10 people on board every single year, diving into this regenerative lifestyle and doing more and more to help this earth thrive. I really believe that if each one of us can just reach 10 people a year, then in less than a decade, that's 10 billion people. That's simple math. It doesn't take a whole lot of faith to believe in something that could be so effective and so simple simultaneously. So get out there and be a teacher. Think about the potential of each one of these plants. Each person that you teach is capable of propagating thousands of trees. Each one of those trees is capable of producing thousands of pounds of food over the course of its life. And we want to live and base our lives on a way of being that includes everyone and that helps to support everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean the mushrooms, I mean the plants, I mean the animals, I mean each other. So let's really start coming together around this concept of regeneration, and let's spread this message far and wide, because it's time for us to come together. It's time for us to celebrate. It's time for us to live regeneratively. And I hope that you've enjoyed these 9 steps towards a more regenerative lifestyle. And if you like what you've been hearing today, go ahead and check the links below. There are ways that you can keep in touch with me, with Mettā, and with the whole Catharsis crew. Yeah, keep in touch with the whole Catharsis crew, and keep on connecting, keep on living more regenerative. Peace, family.